Greetings, seekers of unsettling truths. We're heading to ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization and truly awful construction jobs. Forget the grand ziggurats. Imagine your life's work hauling sun-baked mud bricks under a punishing sun, only to see your creation dissolve in the next epic flood. Being a builder here sucked spectacularly. It was less an epic saga and more a tale of pure, back-breaking misery. Your worst DIY project is a luxury vacation by comparison. Prepare for a history lesson that's genuinely excruciating, exploring the dreadful reality of their craft. Welcome to Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the very cradle of civilization. Here, humanity invented cities, writing, and monumental architecture that reached for the heavens. From the ziggurats of Ur to the palaces of Babylon, they built a world of wonder from the earth itself. This legacy inspires awe even today, but we're not here for the kings or gods. We are here for the souls who actually built it all. Brick by painful brick, their story is written not on tablets, but in the sweat and dust of history. A testament to endurance against excruciating labor. The irony of Mesopotamia is staggering. This culture of brilliant innovators developed complex mathematics, intricate law codes, and even the transformative invention of the wheel. Yet for the common builder, this progress often felt like a distant and cruel joke. The wheel might turn on a royal chariot, but it wasn't on the wheelbarrow you desperately needed. That useful tool simply hadn't been invented yet. As architects planned their grand designs, you remained the primary machine. Hauling mud and bricks on your own exhausted back. They invented the future, but you were trapped in an agonizing cycle of manual toil. Let's talk about your primary co-worker, mud. The building block of Mesopotamian civilization wasn't quarried stone, it was the humble, heavy, and fragile mud brick. The process was a relentless cycle of torment. You'd dig clay from the riverbanks, mix it with water and straw, and stomp the gritty slurry into a paste with your bare feet. This was packed into wooden molds and left to bake under the unforgiving sun. Each brick felt as heavy as stone, and you had to make and carry thousands upon thousands. It was monotonous work, the foundation of an empire built on dirt and human despair. A builder's day began before dawn and ended long after sunset. There were no weekends or holidays. The rhythm of your life was the endless demand of the construction site. There was absolutely no shade, only the relentless, punishing glare of the sun. The air was thick with fine dust coating your throat and lungs. Dehydration was a constant, deadly threat. The tasks were brutally repetitive, hoisting heavy baskets of earth, mixing mortar, passing bricks in a long human chain. Your only tools were your hands, your back, and your endurance, all being systematically destroyed. The physical toll was immense and inescapable. Your hands, constantly working with abrasive mud and sharp straw, were a raw mass of calluses and bleeding splinters. Your spine ached from a permanent stoop. Injury was a constant specter. A slip or a falling brick meant an immediate loss of work. In a world of daily rations, if you couldn't work, you and your family couldn't eat. There was no medical leave or sympathy from the overseers. The project's deadline was infinitely more important than your life. You were, in the most literal sense, completely disposable. Beyond physical pain was a unique psychological dread. Imagine spending months building a wall, only for a sudden rainstorm to turn your strenuous work back into a pathetic heap of sludge. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the civilization's lifeblood, were also its greatest threat. Annual floods could be catastrophic, washing away foundation. You were in a constant losing battle against the elements, forced to watch your labor dissolve into nothing, then start all over again with a broken spirit. It was the very definition of soul-crushing work. And where were you in the grand narratives? Invisible. History remembers the kings and priests. It was the king's name stamped on millions of bricks, claiming the work for all of eternity. You, the builder, were anonymous. Worse, you were likely forced labor. Much of this was built by the corvée system, a state-mandated labor tax. For months at a time, you had to leave your life behind to toil on the king's projects. It wasn't a job, it was servitude. cementing an order that placed you at the absolute bottom. What was your reward for building eternity? Not wealth or fame. Your payment came as meager daily rations, barley, oil, and beer. This beer wasn't a refreshing drink, it was a thick, liquid bread, a vital source of calories to keep you moving. You were given just enough to survive to do it all again tomorrow. As you built glorious temples for gods and palaces for kings, your own life remained a grim cycle of labor for survival. Behind every ancient wonder is this truth. It was built on the backs of people whose lives by any modern standard completely and utterly sucked. Settle in and let the sounds of the present fade away. We are traveling back, not to the clash of swords or the whispers of kings, but to the soft, steady rhythm of relentless work. We are going to a place in time where history was not yet written in ink, but was being built, one heavy, miserable brick at a time. Let your mind drift as we explore the dark, difficult, and frankly dreadful world of a builder in ancient Mesopotamia. Tonight, our focus is on the very substance of this ancient world, the material that defined every home, every temple, and every city wall. We are not speaking of the grand golden sandstone of Egypt, nor the pristine white marble of Greece. No, the Mesopotamian builder was afforded no such luxury. Their world, their work, their entire existence was centered around one thing: mud. We will spend our time tonight getting intimately acquainted with this mud. We will learn of its composition, its heft, and its profound fragility. The Akkadian word for brick was libitu, and this humble object was the builder's constant companion. It was their creation, their burden, and the source of their unending toil. The libitu was the alpha and the omega of their professional lives, a symbol of a civilization built from the literal ground up. The recipe for a Mesopotamian mud brick was deceptively simple, a trinity of basic elements. The first, of course, was clay, the thick alluvial soil deposited by the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The second was water, the lifeblood of the civilization, and the agent required to make the clay workable. The third and final ingredient was a temper, a binding agent, usually straw or reeds, that gave the finished brick a semblance of internal strength. Let us first consider the clay. This was not sourced from some pristine, special quarry. It was dug, by hand, from the riverbanks, or from designated pits near the construction site. Imagine the builder armed with little more than a reed basket and perhaps a primitive spade digging into the earth. The soil was dense, heavy, and wet, a thick sludge that fought back with every shovelful. This was the very first step in a long and arduous process, and it began with wrestling the earth itself. Next came the water. In the blistering heat of ancient Iraq, water was life, but for the builder, it was also another burden to be carried. It had to be hauled in jars or water skins from the nearest canal or river, often a significant distance from the brick-making field. Countless trips back and forth just to gather enough liquid to turn a pile of stubborn dirt into a workable paste. The work began with labor, just to prepare for more labor. And then the binder. The most common choice was straw, the leftover stalks from the barley harvest. This was mixed into the mud to provide tensile strength, preventing the brick from cracking as it dried. When straw was scarce, dried reeds or even animal dung would be used instead. Imagine the sensory experience. The smell of wet earth mingled with the scent of damp, decaying straw and the unmistakable aroma of manure, all baking together under a punishing sun. These three ingredients were brought to a mixing pit, a shallow depression in the ground that served as a primitive workspace. Here, the clay, water, and straw were combined. But how were they mixed? Not with machines, not with great tools, but with the builder's own body. The most efficient way to blend this thick, resistant slurry was to stomp on it with bare feet, a process known as puddling. Picture it now. A worker standing thigh-deep in this cool, gritty paste, treading mud for hours on end. With every step, the mud would squish between their toes, a constant, abrasive friction. Sharp pieces of straw or hidden pebbles in the clay would poke and scrape at their skin. This was not a pleasant, therapeutic mud bath. It was the thankless, painful task of forcing three simple ingredients to become one. Your job description was, in essence, professional dirt wrestler. with a side of sunstroke. Achieving the correct consistency was a genuine skill, learned through years of experience. If the mixture was too wet, the finished brick would slump and lose its shape as it dried. It would be weak and useless. If the mixture was too dry, it would be impossible to work with, and the resulting brick would be crumbly and brittle, cracking before it could ever be placed in a wall. The foreman would be watching, and any wasted material was a mark against you. Once the mud was of the perfect texture, it was time to shape the bricks. For this, the builder had a simple, yet essential tool, a rectangular wooden mold, opened on the top and bottom. This was the ancient equivalent of an assembly line, and the mold was the key to creating the uniform bricks needed to build a stable wall. These molds were precious, one of the few pieces of technology the common builder possessed. The builder would scoop up a great dollop of the prepared mud and slam it into the mold. They would have to pack it in tightly with their hands, forcing out any air pockets that could create a weakness in the brick. The rhythmic thud of mud being packed into molds would have been one of the defining sounds of any Mesopotamian construction site, a percussive beat underlying the hum of human effort. After packing the mold, the excess mud was scraped off the top, usually with a flat piece of wood or simply by hand. Then came the delicate part. The builder would carry the heavy, filled mold to the drying field, place it on the flat, prepared ground, and carefully lift the frame straight up, leaving behind a perfectly formed, wet, and incredibly fragile rectangle of mud. This process was repeated, endlessly. Brick after brick was laid out in neat, sprawling rows under the open sky. A large construction project, like a temple platform or a city wall, would require a vast expanse of land dedicated solely to the drying of millions upon millions of bricks. The sight would have been staggering, a geometric pattern of dark, wet earth stretching out to the horizon. Here, the builder's greatest ally and most persistent tormentor took over, the sun. The Mesopotamian sun was a brutal force, capable of baking the land and the people who worked it. For the bricks, this heat was essential. It would slowly draw the moisture out, hardening the clay into a durable, usable building material. But for the builder working in that same field, the sun was a constant threat, bringing the risk of heat exhaustion, severe burns, and sunstroke. The work did not stop once the bricks were laid out. They could not simply be left to bake on one side. After a day or two, once they were firm enough to handle, they had to be carefully turned onto their sides to allow the bottom to dry evenly. This meant more bending, more lifting, another monotonous task in a long list of them, ensuring each brick was uniformly cured. Let's consider the finished product. A standard sun-dried brick from, say, the period of Ur, around 4,000 years ago, was a substantial object. It was roughly the size of a modern briefcase, but solid all the way through. It could weigh as much as 15 kilograms, or over 30 pounds. Now, imagine lifting and carrying not one, but hundreds of these every single day. The sheer quantity of bricks required is almost impossible for the modern mind to comprehend. A simple family home might require a few thousand bricks. A defensive city wall, like the one that surrounded Babylon, would have used millions upon millions. The great Ziggurat of Ur, a solid core structure, is estimated to have been built from over 70 million bricks, every single one made by hand. And for all this effort, the final product was heartbreakingly fragile. The key weakness of the sun-dried brick was inherent in its name. It was dried, not fired. While hard enough for construction, it had a mortal enemy, water. A heavy, prolonged rain could soften the outer layers of a wall, turning it back into the mud from which it came. A flood, a common occurrence in the land between the rivers, could dissolve the base of a structure entirely, causing a catastrophic collapse. To add a layer of royal insult to the builder's physical injury, the most important bricks were often personalized, but not by the person who made them. Kings and rulers would have special bricks created with their names, or a dedication to a god stamped into the clay while it was still wet. This meant that the king's name, not the builder's, was immortalized within the walls of the structure, a permanent claim of ownership over another person's labor. There was a superior alternative, the kiln-ferried brick. By baking the bricks in a superheated oven, or kiln, the clay would vitrify, becoming as hard as stone and, crucially, waterproof. This was the pinnacle of Mesopotamian brick technology. However, it was a luxury reserved for only the most important projects. The fuel needed for a kiln, wood or charcoal, was scarce in Mesopotamia, making fired bricks incredibly expensive. They were used sparingly, often as an outer, protective layer for a ziggurat or palace. Even more luxurious were the glazed bricks. For these, a silica-based paste was applied to the brick before firing, which would melt into a waterproof colored glass coating. This is how the breathtaking blues and yellows of Babylon's famous Ishtar Gate were created. For the average builder, however, these advanced techniques were an entirely different world. Their life was the sun-dried brick in all its heavy, dusty, and dissolvable glory. The mortar used to bind these bricks together was often just more of the same, a thin, wet mud mixture that would dry and hold the bricks in place. For more prestigious buildings, the mortar of choice was bitumen. This black, sticky, tar-like substance is a form of petroleum that naturally seeps from the ground in parts of modern-day Iraq. It was a fantastic waterproof adhesive, but it was also messy, smelly, and difficult to work with. And so the builder's life was tied to the life cycle of the brick. From the wet, chaotic mess of the mixing pit to the uniform, sun-baked precision of the drying field, to its final, anonymous placement in a massive wall. The brick's journey from dirt to structure was the builder's own journey, a daily transformation of their sweat and toil into the fabric of a civilization that would barely remember their name. If this deep and detailed dive into the delightful misery of the past is the kind of journey that quiets your restless mind, if these stories from the dark corners of history bring you a strange sort of comfort, then there is a simple, silent act you should perform. It is an act of allegiance to our shared exploration of all things dreadful and forgotten. Find the subscribe button. Let your finger drift towards it now. Press it. It costs you nothing but a fleeting moment of effort, yet it provides everything for us. Your subscription ensures that our quiet voyages into the past can continue. Night after sleepy night, it allows us to keep unearthing these tales for you. Do it now as you settle deeper into the darkness and let the grim realities of yesterday bring you peace today. Draw the curtains on the modern world and let us journey back once more. Settle into the quiet of your room and allow my voice to be your guide. We are returning to the sun-scorched plains of ancient Mesopotamia to continue our exploration of why it was so profoundly dreadful to be a builder in the cradle of civilization. Tonight we turn our attention from the earth beneath their feet to the sky above their heads and the relentless, suppressive force that ruled it. We speak, of course, of the sun. But this is not the gentle, life-giving sun of a temperate land. This is the Mesopotamian sun, an antagonist in our story, a malevolent eye in the sky that baked the very spirit out of the land and the people who worked it. For the builder, this celestial body was not a friend. It was the warden of an open-air prison, and its sentence was hard labor under conditions of extreme heat. The land itself offered no mercy. The vast plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were for the most part flat and featureless. There were no rolling hills to cast long shadows, no dense forests to offer a cool green canopy. The builder's world was a panorama of earth and sky, with nothing to mediate between them. They worked in a state of constant, total exposure, with nowhere to hide from the sun's unblinking gaze. The Mesopotamian year knew only 2 real seasons, an oppressively hot summer and a milder but still challenging winter. The summer, which spanned many months, was not just a season, it was a siege. From late spring to early autumn, the land was trapped in a relentless oven. The builder didn't just have a few difficult days to endure, they faced a months-long sentence of working under an incinerating heat that would test the very limits of human endurance. The assault began with the light itself. The glare of the sun reflecting off the pale, dusty ground and the light-colored surfaces of unfinished mud brick walls was blinding. Builders would have spent their days in a perpetual, painful squint, their eyes watering from the strain. The world would have been bleached of color, reduced to a shimmering, overexposed landscape that offered no visual rest, only a constant, painful brightness. And this was not always a dry, clear heat. The presence of the two great rivers and the countless irrigation canals that crisscrossed the land often added a thick, soupy humidity to the air. This combination was especially cruel. The heat would draw moisture from the rivers, hanging it in the atmosphere like a hot, wet blanket, stifling the air and preventing sweat from evaporating effectively. It was like working in a steam room with no doors and no exit. The daily rhythm of the heat was a predictable torture. The mornings offered a brief, deceptive respite, a coolness that would vanish almost as soon as the sun cleared the horizon. By mid-morning, the temperature was already climbing to uncomfortable levels. By noon, it was an inferno. The heat seemed to rise in waves from the ground itself, as if the earth were trying to reject the sun's energy, creating a shimmering, distorted view of the world just above the surface. In our modern age, we are masters of our environment, but for the ancient builder, there was no escape. Forget air conditioning, your cooling system was basically just sweating, and a lot of it. The human body's only defense against such an onslaught was to pour out moisture in a desperate attempt to cool the skin. This was their only technology for thermal regulation, and in the face of the Mesopotamian summer, it was a defense that was destined to fail. The very air they breathed was an enemy. It was hot, heavy, and stagnant. Every gust of wind, every movement of the workers, would kick up clouds of fine dust from the arid ground and the construction site. This dust would hang in the thick, humid air, sticking to their perpetually sweat-drenched skin, forming a gritty, uncomfortable crust on their bodies by the end of the day. They didn't just feel the heat, they wore it. The most immediate and constant danger was dehydration. In such heat, the body loses water at an alarming rate. A builder would have felt a persistent, gnawing thirst, a dry, sticky mouth, and a pounding headache that signaled the body's desperate cry for fluid. Water was the most precious resource on site, more valuable than any building material, yet it was likely rationed, doled out carefully by the overseers. And the water they did receive offered little in the way of refreshment. It would have been stored in porous clay jars or animal skin bags, and by midday it would be unpleasantly lukewarm. It would taste of the earth from which the jar was made, or the faint leathery tang of the water skin. You would drink not for pleasure, but out of grim necessity, forcing down the tepid liquid simply to keep yourself from collapsing. If a builder failed to drink enough, their body would begin to shut down. The first stage was heat exhaustion. A wave of profound weakness would wash over them. Their muscles, deprived of fluids and electrolytes, would begin to cramp violently. Nausea would churn in their stomach, and a feeling of dizziness would make it impossible to stand, let alone lift a 30-pound brick. This was the body's final warning signal. To ignore that warning was to invite death. Heatstroke was the next and final stage. This is when the body's internal thermostat breaks completely. The sweating stops, the skin becomes hot and dry to the touch. The builder would become confused, disoriented, perhaps mumbling incoherently before losing consciousness. In the ancient world, without modern medical intervention, heatstroke was a swift and certain killer, a very real and very common workplace fatality. For those who survived the day, the sun left its mark. Their skin, exposed for hours on end, would be a patchwork of angry red sunburn. On their necks, shoulders, and backs, the skin would blister, peel, and crack, creating open sores that would be instantly irritated by the dust and sweat of the following day. They had no concept of melanoma, but their bodies were under a constant assault from ultraviolet radiation. The builder's eyes were under a similar attack. Beyond the temporary pain of the daily glare, the constant exposure to dust and unfiltered UV light would have caused long-term damage. Chronic inflammation, cataracts, and even eventual blindness were the likely rewards for a lifetime spent squinting into the Mesopotamian sun. The heat could also play tricks on the mind. In the shimmering distance, across the baking plain, a builder might see a mirage, a glistening pool of water, a cool oasis that promised relief. It was a cruel optical illusion, a phantom of hope in a hopeless landscape. As they moved closer, the illusion would retreat, and then vanish, leaving only the dry, cracked earth and a deeper sense of despair. And when the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the relief was minimal. The night did not bring a refreshing coolness. The countless mud bricks, the city walls and the ground itself, having absorbed a full day of solar energy, would now begin to radiate that heat back into the environment. The nights were often just as stifling as the days, making restful sleep a near impossibility before the cycle began all over again. What little protection they had was pitifully inadequate. Their clothing was by necessity minimal. Most common laborers would have worn a simple linen kilt or loincloth. While this prevented the wearer from overheating, it offered zero protection from the sun's direct rays, leaving the vast majority of their skin exposed and vulnerable. Some may have worn a simple cloth wrapped around their head. This could provide a small measure of shade for the face and scalp, and when soaked in water, it could offer a brief, fleeting sensation of coolness. But it was a flimsy shield against an unrelenting enemy, a gesture of defense in a battle they were destined to lose each and every day. The rhythm of the workday was dictated by the sun. Labor would begin in the pre-dawn gloom, the workers taking advantage of the coolest part of the day for the heaviest tasks. But as the sun climbed higher, the work would slow, the pace becoming more sluggish and deliberate. There may have been a pause during the peak heat of midday, but where could one go? In a vast, shadeless construction site, the only shade available was the thin sliver cast by a half-finished wall. The psychological toll of this constant, oppressive heat cannot be overstated. Imagine the sheer monotony of the physical labor, now compounded by the debilitating weight of the heat. It would have fostered a deep sense of lethargy and hopelessness. Tempers would have frayed easily. It was a climate that didn't just exhaust the body, it methodically wore down the human spirit. Even the wind offered no comfort. A breeze in this land was not a cooling caress. It was a blast from a furnace. The notorious Shamal winds could sweep across the plains for days, picking up sand and dust and hurling it at the builders. This hot, gritty wind would dry out their mouths, sting their eyes, and feel like being sandblasted by a hairdryer, offering no relief whatsoever. The Mesopotamian builder was in many ways a creature forged in this oven. Their bodies were likely acclimated to a degree that we can scarcely imagine. But they were not superhuman. They were flesh and blood, susceptible to the same physical laws as us. The heat was a silent, invisible foreman, constantly pushing them, testing their limits and silently claiming the lives of those who faltered. This was their reality, a trifecta of suffering, where the heavy, unyielding mud was made into bricks, under the watchful eye of a merciless, burning sun. The builder's life was a ceaseless struggle, not just against the weight of their materials, but against the very climate they were forced to endure. Their sweat was the mortar that held an empire together. If these journeys into the sweltering, difficult lives of the past help to cool your own racing thoughts, if the dark history of their suffering brings a strange quiet to your mind, then there is a simple duty you can perform. It is a quiet gesture of support that allows our nightly travels to continue. Find that subscribe button. Let it be the one simple task you complete before you drift away. A single click ensures that these stories, unearthed from the dust of forgotten lives, will be here for you again tomorrow night and the night after. Do it now. Lend us your support as you surrender to the darkness, and let the grim tales of yesterday bring you a profound peace in the present. Settle back into the darkness and let the world outside your room dissolve. We are returning to the land between the rivers, to the age of the first cities, to continue our somber account of the Mesopotamian builder. We have felt the weight of the mud and the scorch of the sun. Tonight, we turn our attention to the environment itself, to the two great rivers that gave this land its name and its people so much grief. The Tigris and the Euphrates. These were not merely rivers, they were the central characters in the Mesopotamian story. They were fickle, powerful, and unpredictable deities of water and silt. They were the source of the fertile soil that allowed civilization to bloom in the desert, a miracle of abundance that fed the first cities. But this fertility, this life-giving power, came at a terrible, terrifying price. For the builder, this paradox was a daily reality. The rivers provided the very clay and water needed to form his bricks, the foundational elements of his trade. Yet these same rivers were a constant existential threat. They were the source of his livelihood and the potential source of his complete and utter ruin. The rivers gave, and the rivers, with violent and indifferent fury, took away. The primary difference between the rivers of Mesopotamia and the celebrated Nile of Egypt was a matter of timing and temperament. The Nile flooded gently, predictably, in the late summer after the harvest, an event so reliable it was the very center of Egyptian life and religion. The Tigris and Euphrates, however, were wild and chaotic. Fed by the melting snows in the distant mountains of Anatolia, they would flood violently in the late spring. This timing was catastrophic. For the farmer, the flood often came just as the barley was ripening in the fields, wiping out the year's harvest. For the builder, it was just as devastating. The late spring was a prime season for construction, yet it was precisely when the rivers were most likely to surge, unleashing a torrent of destruction upon any project unfortunate enough to be near their banks. These were not gentle, rising waters. A Mesopotamian flood was a raging, roaring event. Imagine the sound. A low rumble in the distance, growing into a deafening roar as a wall of brown, churning water swept across the flat plains. It would have annihilated everything in its path: work camps, stacks of carefully made tools, and, most heartbreakingly, the foundations and walls that had been painstakingly built over months. The aftermath was a scene of profound desolation. The world would be transformed into a vast, silent lake of murky water and thick, sucking mud. The neat, geometric rows of drying bricks in the brick field would be gone, dissolved back into the primordial sludge from which they came. The lower courses of a new temple or city wall would have simply vanished. For the builder, it was the ultimate Sisyphean task, a constant, soul-crushing cycle of construction and This looming threat created a unique and pervasive psychological terror. Every builder, every foreman, every architect lived with a constant, low-level anxiety. Every day they would have watched the level of the rivers, watched the color of the water, sniffed the air for any sign of change. The river was a monster sleeping fitfully nearby, and no one ever knew what might cause it to awaken and unleash its fury. This deep cultural trauma is woven into the very fabric of their history. The famous flood narrative from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a great flood sent by the gods to wipe out humanity, was not a fantasy, it was a memory, an expression of the very real and recurring disaster that plagued the people of this land. Their greatest literature was a reflection of their greatest and most immediate fear. They tried to fight back, of course. They built an elaborate system of dikes, canals, and levees to try to manage the flow of water. But these defenses were made of the very same material the flood so easily destroyed: mud brick. A particularly violent flood could breach these defenses in an instant, turning their own engineering against them as the channeled water became even more destructive. The battle against the rivers was one they could never truly win. But the horror of the flood did not end when the waters receded. In fact, a new, more insidious horror was just beginning. The floodwaters would leave behind countless pools of stagnant, marshy water, turning large swathes of the landscape into a fetid, temporary swamp. And in these warm, still waters, a new enemy would arise in buzzing, humming clouds. We speak of the mosquito. This tiny insect, this whining spectre of the swamps, was perhaps a greater threat to the builder than the floods themselves. And the builder's worksite, with its excavated pits for mixing mud and its nearby irrigation canals, was the perfect five-star breeding ground for these disease-carrying pests. They lived and worked in the very heart of mosquito country. Your workplace, as a Mesopotamian builder, came with a complementary side of swamp fever. This wasn't just a quaint term for feeling unwell, it was a grim reality. The constant presence of mosquitoes meant the constant presence of the diseases they carried. The builders were a captive food source, exposed and vulnerable, with no protection against the nightly assault. While the ancients did not understand germ theory, they certainly understood the symptoms of what we now know as malaria. They documented the recurring cycle of agonizing fevers that plagued those who lived and worked near the marshes. Imagine the onset, a sudden, violent chill that shakes the entire body, chattering the teeth and turning the skin to goose flesh, even under the heat of the sun. This bone-rattling cold would then give way to a raging, burning fever. The skin would become hot and dry, the head would pound, and the mind would drift into a state of delirium. This torment would last for hours, before finally breaking in a drenching sweat that soaked the builder's clothes and reed mat, leaving them utterly and completely exhausted, too weak to even lift their own head. And the cruelty of malaria is its recurring nature. It was not a one-time illness. A builder who contracted it would be marked for life. They would suffer these debilitating episodes periodically, without warning. Each bout would leave them unable to work for days, sometimes weeks. In a society where you were paid in daily rations, being unable to work meant being unable to eat. Sickness was a death sentence delivered in slow, feverish installments. Malaria was not the only invisible enemy lurking in the water. The same stagnant pools and contaminated canals were breeding grounds for a host of other waterborne illnesses. Dysentery and diseases similar to cholera would have been rampant, spreading quickly through the dense, unsanitary conditions of a workers' camp. The very water they had to drink to survive the heat could be laced with life-threatening bacteria. Their medicine offered little hope. A healer might offer a magical incantation to appease the demon they believed caused the fever, or prescribe a bitter herbal remedy, but against the microscopic parasites of malaria or the bacteria of dysentery, these efforts were futile. For the common builder, there was no cure. There was only the hope that their body was strong enough to survive the latest onslaught. The floodplain was home to other, more tangible threats as well. Scorpions, seeking refuge from the heat, would often hide in the cool dampness of the mud piles or half-finished walls. Venomous snakes, common in the marshes, posed a constant threat, and great, biting clouds of sandflies could descend upon the workers, leaving painful, itching welts on any exposed skin. And then there was the smell. The air in the floodplains was thick with the aroma of life and decay. The scent of damp, rich earth, mixed with the sour smell of rotting vegetation left behind by the last flood. This was layered with the miasma of stagnant water and the general unsanitary odors of thousands of people living and working in close quarters. It was an olfactory assault. The very ground beneath their feet was a challenge. After a flood, the landscape became a treacherous quagmire. The thick, sucking mud could pull a reed sandal right off a worker's foot or trap the wheels of an ox cart. Every movement was difficult, every step a struggle against the sticky, grasping earth. It was a landscape that actively resisted their efforts to build upon it. The builder was thus trapped in a cruel paradox. They were commanded to erect monuments of permanence in a land defined by violent, destructive change. They were tasked with creating order out of the chaos of the floodplains, using the very materials of that chaos. They were fighting a war on two fronts, against the sudden, overwhelming power of the flood and the slow, insidious attack of the fevers bred in its aftermath. This was the environment that forged the first cities. It was a place of incredible abundance and incredible danger. The builders who raised the walls of Uruk and the ziggurats of Ur were not just laborers, they were survivors. They persevered in a place that seemed actively hostile to their existence, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but also a dark reminder of the immense suffering that underpinned ancient progress. If this descent into the damp, diseased, and dangerous world of the ancient past brings a certain calm to your soul, if these stories of struggle help to quiet the noise of the present, then there is one small, silent task for you to perform. It is a simple gesture that allows these nightly historical explorations to continue. Find the subscribe button. Let your finger find its purpose in the darkness. A single, effortless click from you provides the essential support for us to continue our work. It ensures that when you return tomorrow night, seeking refuge in the past, a new chapter of dark history will be waiting for you. Do it now, as you drift further into the quiet of the night. Subscribe, and let the grim tales of yesterday guide you toward a peaceful sleep. Settle in once more, and let the sounds of your world begin to soften. We are traveling back through the quiet corridors of time, back to the sun-drenched plains of ancient Mesopotamia. We have waded through the mud and endured the oppressive heat. Tonight, we examine the very tools in the builders' hands and the incredible, almost impossible tasks they were expected to perform with them. Before we begin, picture a modern construction site. See the towering cranes, hear the roar of diesel engines, the whine of power tools, the hydraulic hiss of a forklift. Now, in your mind, let it all fade to silence. Strip away the steel, the engines, the electricity, the complex machinery. Strip it all away until nothing is left but the earth, the sky, and human beings. This is the world of the Mesopotamian builder. The story of their work is one of a staggering, almost comical disparity. On one hand, you have the ambition, monumental temples reaching for the heavens, massive city walls stretching for miles, intricate canal systems that reshape the very landscape. On the other hand, you have the means to achieve it. A handful of simple, primitive tools that were barely an extension of the builder's own hands. There were no cranes, no power drills, no earth movers. There was just you, your aching back, and a literal mountain of mud that needed to be moved. The single most important machine on any construction site, the engine that powered the rise of the first cities, was the human body itself. And like any machine, run too hard for too long, it was prone to breaking down. Let us open the ancient builder's toolkit and examine its contents. The most fundamental tool was the spade or shovel. Do not picture a modern steel shovel. This would have been a simple, flat piece of wood, perhaps with a long handle. For more important projects, the digging edge might be sheathed in a thin layer of copper, a soft metal that wore down quickly. For most, it was just wood, fire-hardened to give it a bit more resilience. Alongside the spade was the pick. Again, this was likely a heavy, pointed piece of wood, sometimes with a stone or copper head. It was used for breaking up hard, compacted earth, or chipping away at soft gypsum rock. Imagine the feeling of using such a tool. The dull, jarring thud of every blow, the shock vibrating up the wooden handle and into your already aching arms and shoulders. Once the earth was dug, it had to be moved. For this, the builder had the ancient equivalent of the wheelbarrow, the basket. Woven from tough reeds or palm fibers, these simple containers were used to transport everything: dirt, clay for bricks, the wet mud itself, even the builder's meager daily rations. Everything was carried in a basket. The act of carrying this basket was a constant, repetitive strain. A worker would hoist the heavy, loaded container onto their shoulder, or, more often, balance it on their head. The rough woven reeds would chafe and abrade their skin, leaving it raw and sore, and the number of trips was endless. To build anything of significance required thousands upon thousands of individual basket loads of earth, a relentless shuttle run from the pit to the wall. Another key, if simple, tool was the brick mold. As we have discussed, this was a plain, bottomless wooden box used to give mud bricks their uniform shape. This single object represented one of the few pieces of precision technology available. Its sharp corners and flat sides were the basis for all the straight walls and right angles the builders were expected to create. Its consistency was the only thing standing between an orderly structure and a lumpy pile of dirt. To pull and to haul, the builder had rope. This was not the strong synthetic rope of today. It was coarse cordage painstakingly twisted from palm fibers, flax, or reeds. It was abrasive to the hands, and its strength was always a matter of faith. A frayed rope could snap at any moment, sending a heavy block of stone plummeting downwards, or a team of men tumbling to the ground. For tasks requiring brute impact, there were stone hammers. These were the simplest tools of all, often just a suitably heavy hand-sized stone, perhaps shaped with a groove to attach a wooden handle. They were used for pounding earth to make a firm foundation, for driving wooden stakes into the ground, or for breaking up large clods of dirt. It was percussion by its most basic definition. The most advanced machines on any Mesopotamian worksite were the lever and the roller. The lever was a sturdy wooden pole, used to pry a heavy object a few inches off the ground. The rollers were a series of logs, placed under a massive stone block to allow it to be moved across the ground. Using these required immense coordination and was fraught with peril. A slipped lever or a cracked roller could have devastating consequences. And these few precious tools required constant maintenance. A wooden handle, dried and cracked by the sun, could splinter and break at any moment. The soft copper edge of a spade would quickly wear down and need to be resharpened. In a world with no hardware stores, the builder had to be their own repairman, spending their precious evening hours mending the very tools that had exhausted them all day. To overcome the limitations of these tools, the Mesopotamians relied on the organized application of human power. To move materials up the rising walls of a ziggurat, they formed human chains. A line of men would stand on the ramps or scaffolding, passing baskets of mud or individual bricks from one person to the next, up and up, in a steady, monotonous rhythm that would last the entire day. The primary method for building tall structures was the ramp. This was a colossal project in itself. To build a 50-foot-high wall, a ramp of packed earth had to be built alongside it, a gentle slope up which workers could carry their loads. This ramp could contain as much material and require as much labor as the final structure itself, and once the project was finished, the ramp had to be dismantled and removed, basket by basket. But truly massive objects, like the multi-ton foundation stones for a temple, or the colossal statues of kings and deities, the only method was hauling. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of men would be put on long ropes attached to a sledge carrying the great stone. An overseer would chant a rhythm, and on his mark all the men would heave as one, straining with every fiber of their being to drag the immense weight just a few inches forward. And all of this was done with absolutely no concept of safety equipment. There were no hard hats to protect from falling debris, no steel-toed boots to guard against a dropped stone, no safety harnesses for those working high on the walls. Your only safety feature was your own vigilance, and the hope that the person working next to you was paying attention. The builder's body was treated as a tool, and it was used accordingly. The hands were used to scoop and pack mud, the shoulders and back served as a crane for lifting and carrying. The legs were the pistons that drove movement, up and down the ramps for 12 hours a day. And like any tool, the body was subject to wear and tear. A lifetime of this labor meant the slow, methodical destruction of joints, muscles, and bone. Perhaps the greatest irony lies with one of Mesopotamia's most famous inventions. Around 3500 BCE, they invented the wheel. But this revolutionary technology was used for pottery and for the war chariots of kings. The simple wheelbarrow, a device that would have transformed construction and saved countless backs, would not be invented for another 3,000 years. The builders saw the wheel, but it was not for him. Yet they achieved remarkable precision. They laid out massive temples with surprising accuracy using simple but ingenious tools. A knotted rope served as a measuring tape, with the distance between knots representing a standard unit, the cubit. A plumb bob, a stone tied to a string, was used to ensure walls were perfectly vertical, and a shallow trough of water could be used to check if a foundation was perfectly level. The foreman, or overseer, had his own set of tools, though they were not for building. His primary tool was his voice, used to chant out rhythms for hauling, to give orders, and to encourage or prescription. A very strong CTA for subscription as well. As you settle into the quiet of the night, let us travel back once more to the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. We have spoken of the materials, the climate, and the tools that defined the builder's world. But tonight, we delve into a darker, more fundamental question. After all we have heard, who would ever willingly choose to do this job? The answer, as you might have guessed, is unsettlingly simple. Almost nobody. The great ziggurats that clawed at the sky and the colossal walls that encircled the first cities were not the product of a motivated professional workforce. They were not built by artisans who took pride in their craft out of passion. They were, for the most part, built by people who had absolutely no choice in the matter. Their presence on the worksite was not voluntary. It was a command. Forget any modern notions of a job application or a career path. The ancient Mesopotamian builder did not choose his profession chose him, with the full, unquestionable authority of the state behind it. Your employment contract, so to speak, was signed on your behalf by your king, often with the silent, implied threat of a very large, very angry sword. The primary mechanism for this mass mobilization of labor was a system known as corvée labor. This was a sophisticated and deeply ingrained form of taxation, but instead of paying the state with silver or a portion of your crops, you paid with your own body, your own time, and your own sweat. It was a tax paid in pure, unadulterated physical exertion. Nearly the entire free male population of a city-state could be subject to this labor duty. If you were a farmer, a potter, a fisherman, or any other commoner, you were on the list. For a designated period each year, you were required by law to drop everything, your tools, your fields, your family, and report for duty on the king's latest grand construction project. Imagine the scene. A proclamation is issued from the temple or palace, read aloud in the city square by a stern-faced official. Scribes with their clay tablets and styluses have the names. The lists are checked. The summons is delivered. There is no polite request, no option to decline. You are now the property of the state, for a little while at least. The state's human resources department was just a man with a list and a few heavily armed friends. Think of the profound disruption this caused. A farmer could be called away right before the crucial planting season. A fisherman might be forced to abandon his nets when the fish were running. Their personal livelihoods were put on hold, sacrificed for the greater glory of the king or the city's patron god. Their own survival took a backseat to the monumental ambitions of the powerful. Of course, the state framed this as a great honor. Building a temple was presented as a sacred duty to the gods, who ensured the land's fertility. Building a new palace or a defensive wall was a civic responsibility, a way to show loyalty to the king who protected you. It was a masterful piece of political propaganda, cloaking state-mandated servitude in the language of piety and patriotism. And what was the compensation for this honorable duty? Not a wage, not a salary. Corvée laborers were given daily rations from the state's storehouses, a measure of barley, a splash of sesame oil, and a jug of beer, just enough calories to keep a man alive and strong enough to work another day. This was not payment for a service rendered. It was fuel for a human machine. The duration of this service varied. It might be for 1 month a year, or perhaps as many as 3. For that entire time you were separated from your home, living in a crowded, unsanitary work camp, subject to the orders of an overseer. Imagine the dread that would build as you knew your term of service was approaching, a dark cloud on the horizon of your year. Was there any way to avoid this fate? For the wealthy and well-connected, perhaps. A rich landowner might be able to pay a hefty fee, likely in silver or grain, to be exempted from his duty, or he could hire a poorer man to take his place, a substitute to serve his term for him. This, of course, meant that the burden of corvée labor fell most heavily on those who could least afford it, the poor and the powerless. This system, as harsh as it was, is what made the grand scale of Mesopotamian civilization possible. It allowed a king to mobilize an immense workforce, sometimes tens of thousands of men, for a single project. This is how they dug the vast networks of canals that irrigated the land, and how they raised the millions of bricks needed for a structure like the great Ziggurat of Ur. It was an empire built on a foundation of temporary, compulsory servitude. Beyond the corvée system, there was an even darker source of labor, outright slavery. While corvée laborers were temporarily unfree, slaves were permanent property. Their entire existence was one of forced labor, and many of them would have ended their lives toiling on these same construction projects. There were several paths into slavery in the ancient world. The most common was to be a prisoner of war. When one city-state conquered another, it was common practice to enslave a large portion of the defeated population. These unfortunate souls would be marched back in chains and put to work for the glory of their new masters. Their old lives were over, replaced by a new reality of unending toil. Another tragically common route was debt slavery. In a world with no bankruptcy protection, a farmer whose crops failed, or a craftsman who fell on hard times, could quickly find himself in insurmountable debt. To settle this account, he could be forced to sell himself, or even his wife and children, into slavery for a set number of years, or sometimes for life. It was the grimmest form of foreclosure imaginable. The life of an enslaved builder was even more wretched than that of a corvée worker. He had no home to return to, no term of service that would eventually end. His labor was not a temporary tax, it was his permanent condition. In the eyes of the law, he was property, a chattel item listed in inventories alongside livestock, furniture, and tools. While some law codes, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, afforded slaves a few, minimal rights, the practical reality was that their life was entirely at the whim of their owner. In the case of state projects, that owner was the temple or the king, an abstract and unfeeling master, whose only concern was the timely completion of the project. These enslaved builders are the most invisible figures in our story. Their individual lives, their names, their origins, are completely lost to history. They were the anonymous, disposable power source for the ancient world. Their immense suffering unrecorded, their contributions claimed entirely by the kings whose names were stamped on the bricks they laid. On any large worksite, a clear hierarchy would have been in place. At the very bottom were the slaves and the corvée laborers, the great mass of unskilled muscle. Slightly above them might be the skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, carpenters, or sculptors, who were likely voluntary workers, true professionals who were compensated better for their specific expertise. Above them were the overseers and foremen. These were the managers, the enforcers. Their job was not to build, but to ensure that the building got done. They maintained discipline, enforced quotas, and served as the physical manifestation of the king's authority, often with a stick or a whip as their primary tool of motivation. And at the very top of this pyramid were the architects and scribes, the educated elite. They understood the mathematics. They drew the plans on clay tablets, and they kept the accounts, tracking the flow of rations and materials. They were the minds behind the operation, separated by an unbridgeable social gulf from the men whose sweat and agony actually brought their designs to life. The magnificent ruins that dot the landscape of modern Iraq are therefore not just monuments to ancient artistry and ambition. They are silent testaments to the power of a state to compel and command. They are symbols of a society built upon a rigid and unforgiving hierarchy, where the labor of the many was extracted for the glory of the few. Let this final thought settle in your mind. Behind the splendor of Babylon, behind the grandeur of Ur, behind every towering wall and sacred temple lies the grim and uncomfortable truth of a civilization built on compulsion. Every single brick was likely laid by a hand that would have desperately preferred to be somewhere else, a hand that was not working but being worked. If these quiet explorations into the coercive and difficult truths of the past provide a strange sort of peace to your own mind, if the darkness of their reality helps to dim the lights on your own day, then there is a simple, silent gesture you can make. It is a gesture that fuels our own labor of love. Find the subscribe button. Let it be the last thing you seek out in the waking world tonight. A simple click from you is the ration that sustains this channel, ensuring that when you return for another journey, we will be here, waiting to guide you. Do it now. Subscribe. And let the great, grim machine of history lull you into a deep and profound sleep. Let us return once more to the quiet hum of the ancient past. Settle into your space, let your breathing slow, and allow the noise of the present day to recede. We are going back to the sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, to the foot of the most ambitious, most awe-inspiring, and most dreadful construction projects ever conceived by the ancient mind. Tonight, we are building a ziggurat. Of all the structures that a Mesopotamian builder could be forced to work on, the ziggurat was the pinnacle. It was the ultimate expression of a king's power and a city's piety. And for the common laborer, it represented the ultimate sentence of hard, unending labor. This was the grand project, the one that would consume generations. First, understand what a ziggurat is. It is not a tomb, like the Great Pyramids of Egypt. A ziggurat was a man-made mountain, a massive, solid, stepped tower with a temple at its very peak. It was designed to be a bridge between the mortal realm on earth and the divine realm of the heavens. It was, in their belief system, a literal stairway for the gods to descend and visit their people. This sacred purpose was the state's justification for the almost unimaginable amount of labor required. You weren't just building a palace for a king, you were building a home for the city's patron god. It was framed as the most sacred work a person could do, but as we shall see, this divine purpose did little to lighten the physical burden. You weren't just building a temple, you were building a literal mountain of mud, one painful brick at a time. Like any great structure, the work began by going down. A massive area had to be excavated, leveled, and prepared to create a foundation stable enough to support the immense weight of the planned structure. This initial stage alone, digging and moving thousands of tons of earth with little more than spades and baskets, would have been a colossal undertaking. The heart of every ziggurat was its solid core, made almost entirely of sun-dried mud bricks. We have spoken of the misery involved in making these bricks, but the ziggurat took this to an entirely new scale. The great ziggurat of Ur, built around 4,100 years ago, is estimated to have a core made of more than 70 million individual bricks. Every single one had to be mixed, molded, dried, and carried by hand. To grasp the scale, consider the base of the ziggurat of Ur. It measured over 200 feet long by 150 feet wide. For the first few years of the project, workers would have seen very little vertical progress. They would have simply been creating a vast, solid platform of mud, an ever-expanding footprint of human toil that seemed to stretch on forever. The retirement plan on a project like this was simply hoping you'd be retired by the gods before the ziggurat was finished. Yet, amidst this brute force, there were touches of ingenuity. Architects understood that the immense core of sun-dried bricks would trap moisture from the clay. To prevent this moisture from creating internal pressure and cracking the structure from within, they designed weeper holes. These were small channels left in the brickwork, allowing the man-made mountain to breathe, slowly exhaling the water vapor from its millions of tons of mud. Once the foundation and the first level were complete, the only way to continue was to go up, and the only way to get materials up was via massive, gently sloping ramps. These ramps, built of packed earth and reinforced with timber, would have hugged the sides of the ziggurat, growing higher and longer as the structure itself grew. Building the ramp was a monumental project within the project. Now, picture the daily life of the ziggurat builder. Your day consists of this: hoisting a heavy basket filled with bricks or a skin filled with sticky bitumen onto your shoulder and beginning the long, slow, agonizing climb up the ramp. The sun beats down on your back, the dust coats your throat, and with every step you feel the strain in your legs and your spine. And the cruel genius of the ziggurat's design is that the work became exponentially harder with every foot of progress. As the structure grew taller, the ramps grew longer. The journey from the ground to the working level, once a short walk, became a significant trek. A trip that took 5 minutes at the start of the project might take 20 minutes a decade later. The reward for your hard work was simply more, harder work. To make this process more efficient, they would have relied on the human chain. Imagine long lines of men snaking their way up the ramps, passing bricks from one to another in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Hand to hand, man to man, the building blocks of the sacred mountain would flow upwards, a human conveyor belt powered by meager rations and the fear of the foreman's displeasure. The solid mud brick core was not the final surface. To protect it from the elements, the entire ziggurat was encased in a thick layer of kiln-filed bricks. These were far more durable and water-resistant, but they were also heavier and required an immense amount of scarce fuel to create. This outer shell meant a whole new phase of labor, hauling heavier bricks even higher up the now colossal structure. This outer casing of baked bricks was often set in place with bitumen for mortar. This black, sticky asphalt, a natural petroleum product, was an excellent waterproof sealant. For the builder, It was a nightmare to work with. It was smelly, messy, and often had to be heated to be applied, adding the risk of severe burns to the long list of daily workplace hazards. Finally, the ziggurat's defining features were its 3 massive staircases, all converging on a gateway at the first level. These were not small, practical stairs. They were monumental, symbolic stairways for the gods. Building them required incredible precision in an age of simple tools, laying heavy baked bricks at a perfect, consistent angle to create a smooth, imposing ascent to the heavens. A project of this magnitude was not completed in a season, or even a few years. A major ziggurat was a multi-generational undertaking. It was not uncommon for a ziggurat to take 50, 60, or even more years to complete. It was less a construction project and more of a permanent feature of the social landscape. This means that a builder could have been conscripted as a young man to work on the foundation and still be hauling bricks for the upper levels as a grandfather. His son, upon coming of age, would join him on the ramps. The ziggurat became a kind of hereditary sentence, a family tradition of back-breaking labor that no one asked for. It wasn't a career, it was a generational curse. The state, of course, would have constantly reinforced the sacred nature of the work. The priests would have performed rituals, the scribes would have written hymns, all praising the construction of the god's holy mountain. But after your 10th year of hauling mud in the blistering heat, or your 20th year of passing bricks until your arms were numb, the divine honor of it all probably began to wear a little thin. Imagine for a moment a builder who has spent his entire life on the project. Now, an old man, he makes the long climb to the nearly completed top level. He stands breathing heavily and looks out. He can see the entire city spread out below him, its walls, its canals, its temples, a city he helped build. The view would be magnificent, but it would be a vista seen through the weary eyes of a man whose life was spent in service to this single colossal monument. At the very summit of the ziggurat was the final goal, a small temple, the dwelling place of the god. This shrine would be beautifully constructed, perhaps with decorative glazed bricks and imported timber. The contrast is staggering. A tiny, perfect jewel of a building, resting atop a colossal mountain of 70 million bricks, representing an almost incalculable expenditure of human effort and time. The ziggurat, then, is the perfect symbol of Mesopotamian civilization. It represents their incredible architectural and organizational skills, their deep and abiding religious faith, and their society's complete and utter willingness to sacrifice the lives and well-being of the common person to achieve the ambitions of the powerful. It is a monument to devotion, built with the currency of human misery. So when you see illustrations of these great stepped towers, try to look beyond the impressive silhouette. See the thousands of individuals toiling in the sun. See the endless lines of men on the ramps, the plumes of smoke from the brick kilns, the shimmer of heat on the horizon. The ziggurat is not just a ruin of crumbling brick, it is a fossilized record of millions of hours of pain, suffering, and endurance. It is, truly, a stairway to a very, very hard heaven. If these journeys into the immense and difficult labors of the past help to bring a sense of quiet to your own world, if the stories of their struggles put your own to rest, then there is one simple act you can perform to ensure these travels continue. It is a quiet gesture, made in the darkness of your room. Please, find the subscribe button. Let it be the final object of your focus tonight. Your subscription is the foundation upon which this channel is built. It costs you nothing, yet it is the single most valuable resource for us. Click it now and let your support be the final, silent act before you let the great, dark river of history carry you off to sleep. Let the quiet of your surroundings be your guide as we journey back in time. Allow the present to fade and your mind to drift. We are returning to ancient Mesopotamia, a land of great invention and even greater hardship. Tonight, we leave the sacred mountains of the ziggurats behind and turn our attention to the sprawling, endless fortifications that defined every city, the Great Walls. In the world of ancient Mesopotamia, prosperity was a dangerous thing. The fertile land between the rivers allowed cities to grow wealthy, to amass stores of grain and treasures of lapis lazuli. But wealth attracts envy, and envy in the ancient world often arrived with an army. To be rich was to be a target, and so the cities began to surround themselves with the ultimate expression of power and paranoia, the city wall. For the king and the priests who lived safely at the city's heart, these walls were the ultimate security blanket. They were a declaration in mud brick, a clear statement to any would-be conqueror that this city was a force to be reckoned with. But for the builder, this security blanket was a crushing weight, a project of such staggering scale and mind-numbing repetition that it made all other labors seem small by comparison. We are not speaking of a simple fence or a wooden palisade. The great walls of cities like Uruk and Babylon were wonders of the ancient world. They were fortifications so thick, so high, and so extensive that they were considered to be the work of gods or mythical heroes. But they were not built by heroes, they were built by ordinary people enduring extraordinary hardship. The goal was to build a wall so big it would make invaders think twice. It mostly just made the builders think about quitting life. The construction of such a wall began, as always, with digging. Imagine a trench, not for a single building, but one that stretched for miles, encircling the entire city. This colossal ditch, sometimes 60 or 70 feet wide, had to be excavated by hand. Basket by basket, tens of millions of cubic feet of earth were hauled away, a task that would take thousands of workers years to complete. Many of the most formidable Mesopotamian cities employed a double-wall system. This was not one line of defense, but two massive parallel walls. The space between them could be filled with packed earth to create an even more formidable barrier, or left as a free-fire zone for defenders to rain down arrows on anyone who breached the outer wall. For the builder, it was a simple, brutal equation. Double the walls meant double the work. The inner wall was the true behemoth. The walls of Babylon, described by the Greek historian Herodotus, were said to be so thick that a 4-horse chariot could be driven along the top. While this may be an exaggeration, archaeological evidence confirms walls that were dozens of feet thick. They were vast, solid corridors of brick, designed to absorb the relentless punishment of siege engines. The outer wall, while smaller, was still a monumental undertaking in its own right. It was the first line of defense, designed to stop an initial assault and slow down an attacking army. Even this lesser wall would have been a major construction project in any other context. Here, it was merely the opening act of a much larger performance of human toil. And the great trench dug for the foundation clay rarely went to waste. It was often connected to a nearby river or canal and flooded, creating a wide, formidable moat. This added another layer of defense, but it also meant the builders were often working in wet, muddy, and disease-ridden conditions at the base of the wall, a constant struggle against the water that was meant to protect them. The material for all this was, of course, the humble mud brick, millions upon millions of them. The inner core of the walls would be made from the cheaper, sun-dried variety, but the outer faces, the parts exposed to the rain and to the enemy, were often sheathed in a layer of stronger, kiln-filed bricks. The logistics of supplying such a sprawling linear project with a constant flow of two different types of bricks were a nightmare in themselves. A city wall was not just a long, flat line. To be effective, it had to have strategically placed defensive towers. Every 100 feet or so, a massive tower would project outwards from the wall. These were multi-story fortresses in their own right, giving defenders a flanking angle to shoot at anyone trying to scale the walls. Each one of these countless towers was a complex vertical building project attached to the main wall. The most intricate parts of the entire system were the gates. A city needed to be defended, but it also needed to trade and function. The gateways were therefore massive, heavily fortified structures often consisting of multiple courtyards, guard chambers, and towering archways. The most famous, like Babylon's Ishtar Gate, were breathtaking masterpieces, decorated with vibrant glazed bricks depicting lions and dragons, a small island of artistry in an ocean of brute force labor. Unlike a ziggurat, where the work was concentrated in one spot, A city wall was a sprawling, linear worksite that stretched for miles. This presented a unique logistical challenge. Thousands of workers had to be managed, supplied, and supervised over an immense distance. The foreman couldn't see the whole project. He could only see his small section of an endless, curving line of brick. And the work itself was the definition of monotony. A builder's task was simple and endlessly repetitive. Lay a course of bricks, slap on a layer of mud mortar, lay the next course. Now, continue doing that for the next 10 hours, and tomorrow, and for the next several years. The only thing that changed was your elevation. Consider the walls of the ancient city of Uruk, one of the first great cities in history. According to legend, they were built by the mythical king Gilgamesh. These walls, constructed around 3000 BCE, ran for a circuit of nearly 10 kilometers, or 6 miles. They enclosed an area of 2 square miles and were said to have 900 towers. The human cost of such a project is difficult to even calculate. Centuries later, the walls of Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar II became the most famous in the world. They were so legendary that they were sometimes included in lists of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The sheer scale was meant to be a form of psychological warfare, to crush an enemy's morale before the siege even began. For the builders, the psychological effect was likely quite similar. This incredible size served a very practical purpose. The walls had to be high enough to make scaling them with ladders under a barrage of arrows a suicidal task, and they had to be thick enough to resist 2 primary forms of attack, the battering ram and sapping, which was the practice of tunneling under the wall to make it collapse. Every foot of thickness was a direct response to a specific threat, and the price of that security was paid by the builder's back. And the work was never truly finished. A structure of this size, made of mud brick, was in a constant state of decay. The sun, the rain, and the shifting earth took their toll. Sections would sag, bricks would crumble, and floods could weaken the foundations. A permanent crew of builders was likely needed just for maintenance and repairs. Your job security was knowing that the wall's slow collapse would provide you with work for life. Working high atop the rising walls was also incredibly dangerous. A moment of dizziness from the heat, a misplaced step on a loose brick, a gust of wind, any of these could send a worker plummeting to their death. There were no safety railings, no harnesses, no nets. The only thing between you and the ground, 60 feet below, was your own sense of balance. From their precarious perch, the builders would have had a commanding view of the world. They could see the green fields and palm groves they were forced to abandon for their labor tax. And on a bad day they might even see the ominous dust cloud of an approaching army, a grim and immediate reminder of exactly why their endless, miserable task was deemed so necessary. There is a final, cruel irony in the city wall. For the citizens inside, the merchants, the priests, the royals, the wall was a symbol of safety and identity. It separated the order of the city from the chaos of the outside world. But for the builder, who spent his days on the wall, it was a constant reminder of his own status. He was the creator of the barrier that protected the elite, yet he himself remained exposed, vulnerable, and unfree. And so the great city walls of Mesopotamia were the ultimate paradox of the ancient world. They were a source of immense security for the state and a source of immense suffering for the individual. They were a triumph of engineering and social organization, achieved through the relentless, repetitive, and compulsory labor of tens of thousands of people who had no say in the matter. When you look at the last, crumbling remains of these ancient fortifications, try to see them for what they are. They are not just walls. They are the faint outlines of a society's greatest fears and its most ruthless ambitions, drawn upon the landscape by the sweat of a generation of builders. Each surviving brick is a monument to a forgotten moment of human misery and endurance. If this deep and detailed exploration of past hardships brings a strange sense of tranquility to your mind, if reflecting on their burdens helps to lighten your own, then please consider performing one simple, quiet act. It is an act that helps us continue to build this library of dark history for you. Find the subscribe button. Let it be the last task of your waking day. A single click, a moment's effort, provides the foundation for everything we do here. It ensures that when you seek comfort in the stories of the past tomorrow night, we will be here waiting. Subscribe now, and let the echoes of their labor carry you gently into sleep. Come, let the day's concerns drift away on the tide of time. We are journeying back to the silty plains of Mesopotamia, to the foot of its great monuments. We have explored the work, the tools, and the compulsion. Tonight, we face the most immediate and visceral reality of the builder's life, the constant, unavoidable threat of physical injury in a world with no safety net to catch him. Let us be clear, a Mesopotamian construction site was not merely an uncomfortable place to work, it was an active theater of peril. There were no safety inspectors, no regulations, no hazard pay. The only operating procedure was the demand to get the job done. The well-being of the individual worker was at best a distant secondary concern, and at worst a complete irrelevance. Every task, from digging clay to laying the final brick atop a ziggurat, was fraught with danger. The concept of a risk assessment was thousands of years in the future. The builder's only defense was his own agility and a healthy dose of luck. And as we know, luck has a tendency to run out. Your retirement plan was mostly just hoping you didn't get crushed by a poorly stacked brick. The most common injuries were, of course, the minor ones, the daily accumulation of small pains. A builder's hands would have been a roadmap of his trade, a testament to constant abuse. Cuts were a daily occurrence, from the sharp edges of fired bricks, the abrasive texture of reed baskets, or the splintered handle of a wooden spade. These small wounds were an accepted part of the job. But in this unsanitary environment, no cut was truly minor. The builder worked with mud, which was often mixed with animal dung. His hands were coated in dust and grime. A simple slice on the finger could, within days, become infected. With no antibiotics, a festering wound could lead to a raging fever, blood poisoning, and a slow, agonizing death. A tiny cut held the potential for a major catastrophe. The splinters were another constant torment. The rough-hewn wood of the tools and the sharp straw used as a binder in the mud bricks would have constantly pierced the skin of the hands and feet. These tiny foreign bodies were not just painful, they were another open door for infection, another source of misery that the builder was simply expected to endure as he worked. The feet and hands would have been locked in a painful cycle of blisters and calluses. The friction of the tools, the pressure of carrying heavy loads, and the endless walking on rough ground would raise painful fluid-filled blisters. These would inevitably break, leaving raw, open sores. Over time, the skin would harden into thick, tough calluses, which would then crack, creating deep, painful fissures. Beyond these surface wounds was the slow, grinding wear and tear on the body. This was the chronic pain that became the builder's constant companion. The endless heavy lifting would lead to strained backs and herniated discs. The repetitive squatting and climbing would wear away the cartilage in the knees. After years of this labor, a man would feel ancient long before his time, his body a geography of aches that never truly subsided. These were the everyday pains. But the worksite also offered a spectacular variety of ways to suffer a major, life-altering trauma. The most persistent threat was from above. High on the rising walls and ziggurats, other men were working, and men, especially tired men, are clumsy. A dropped brick, a dislodged stone, or a fallen tool could plummet from a great height with lethal force. There were no hard hats. The only thing protecting a builder's head was his own awareness of the sky. A brick falling from 50 or 60 feet would not cause a mere injury, it would be a fatal, explosive impact. The foremen would note the loss of a worker, and the project would continue. The demand for bricks was unrelenting even in the face of sudden death. Broken bones were an ever-present risk. A fall from a faulty scaffold, a tumble down a steep ramp, or the collapse of a poorly stacked pile of bricks could easily result in a fractured arm, leg, or ribs. In a world without modern medicine, a broken bone was not a simple inconvenience. It was a potential disaster. Imagine the medical response. There were no emergency rooms, no x-rays, no orthopedic surgeons. A broken leg would be forcefully straightened by a colleague and then crudely splinted with pieces of wood and strips of cloth. If the bone was badly displaced, or worse, a compound fracture that broke the skin, the chances of it healing properly were almost zero. The risk of infection was immense. The most terrifying accidents were the crushing injuries. A section of improperly laid wall could suddenly give way, burying the workers below. A massive foundation stone could slip from its rollers, pinning a man's limbs. A collapsing ramp could send tons of earth and timber cascading downwards. These were events of pure, chaotic violence from which there was often no escape and no survival. And then there was the simple, clean danger of gravity. As the walls and ziggurats climbed higher, the builders had to work at dizzying heights. There were no guardrails, no safety nets, no harnesses. A momentary lapse of concentration, a bout of dizziness from the heat, a sudden gust of wind, any of these could send a man on a fatal one-way journey to the hard-packed earth below. Beyond the obvious traumas, there were the internal injuries caused by the work itself. Straining to lift a load that was too heavy could result in a torn muscle, a slipped disc, or an inguinal hernia. These injuries were invisible but no less debilitating. A man with a severe hernia would be in constant pain, unable to perform the heavy lifting the job required. He was, in an instant, rendered useless to the project. So what happened when a builder was inevitably injured? The answer is the cold, hard heart of the matter: nothing. There was no workers' compensation, no sick leave, no disability insurance. The project felt no obligation to the worker it had broken. The relentless machinery of the state required healthy bodies, and a broken one was simply discarded. The economic consequence of an injury was catastrophic. A builder was paid in daily rations, enough food to feed himself and his family for that day. If he was injured and could not work, his pay stopped instantly. He immediately went from being a provider to being another mouth to feed, a severe burden on his family's already meager resources. An injury threatened the entire household with starvation. What passed for medical care was a combination of the practical and the magical. A healer, known as an asu, might wash the wound and apply a poultice of herbs or a dressing of honey, which has some antiseptic properties. But for the more serious afflictions, the builder might turn to the ashupu, a sort of exorcist who would attempt to drive out the specific demon believed to be causing the ailment through prayers and incantations. For a truly shattered or infected limb, the only option might have been amputation. This would have been a gruesome procedure performed with a bronze saw, with no anesthetic and no understanding of sterilization. The chances of surviving the shock, blood loss, and subsequent infection were terrifyingly slim. For those who survived a major injury but were left permanently disabled, the future was bleak. Unable to perform manual labor, they could no longer serve the state or earn their keep. They would be forced to rely on the charity of their families or join the ranks of beggars at the city gate. Their productive life, and any status it conferred, was over. Imagine the psychological toll this constant risk took. Every day was a gamble. Every step on a scaffold, every basket of bricks passed overhead was a potential source of death or ruin. The builders would have worked with a baseline of fear and anxiety that we can scarcely comprehend, a constant awareness of their own fragility and disposability. The magnificent ruins we see today are therefore built upon a foundation of more than just mud and clay. They are built upon the broken bones, torn muscles, and shattered lives of thousands of forgotten builders. The cost of creating these wonders of the ancient world was paid in human suffering, a price recorded not in silver, but in scars. Let this thought settle. The clean, geometric lines of the ziggurat, the imposing strength of the city walls, these are abstractions. The reality was a chaotic, dangerous, and painful process. The true uninsured risk of the job was not a loss of profit for the king, but the loss of life and limb for the men whose names are lost to time. If this deep dive into the perilous reality of the ancient world has helped to quiet your own anxieties, if the story of their risks has brought a sense of safety to your own quiet room, then please, perform one simple, risk-free action. It is an action that helps us to continue our work. Find the subscribe button. It requires no heavy lifting, no perilous climb. It is a simple, silent click in the darkness. Your subscription is the support that allows us to unearth these stories and share them with you, night after night. Do it now, as you prepare to rest, and let your support be the final, thoughtful act of your day. Let us journey back again into the deep and quiet corridors of the past. Leave the day behind as you settle in, and let your mind drift to the sun-beaten plains of ancient Mesopotamia. We have walked the work site, felt the heat, and feared the flood. Tonight, we look at something even more fundamental, the very fuel that was poured into these human machines to make them run. A great army, as they say, marches on its stomach. The great armies of Mesopotamian laborers were no different. But the state that commanded them was not interested in providing a feast. It was interested in logistics, in efficiency, in providing the absolute minimum amount of fuel required for the maximum possible output of physical labor. This was not a menu, it was a calculation. So banish any thoughts of a varied and satisfying diet. The magnificent temples and towering walls of the first cities were not built on a foundation of wholesome nutrition. They were built on a monotonous, meager, and profoundly boring diet designed not for health or pleasure, but for the singular purpose of keeping a worker on his feet for one more day of toil. The undisputed king, the beginning and the end of the Mesopotamian builder's diet, was barley. This hardy, versatile grain was the cornerstone of their civilization and the primary currency of their rations. It was the alpha and the omega of their culinary world. The state-sponsored food pyramid was not a pyramid at all. It was a very large, very flat circle made almost entirely of barley. The most common way a builder would consume this barley was in the form of a simple, thick porridge or gruel. Imagine a coarse ground barley boiled with water into a bland, textureless mush. It would have been gritty, heavy, and utterly devoid of any strong flavor. This was not a comforting bowl of oatmeal. It was a caloric delivery system in its most basic form. The other primary option was barley bread. Again, do not picture a soft, fluffy loaf. This would have been a dense, hard, unleavened flatbread, likely baked on hot stones or clay ovens. It would have been tough to chew and often gritty with sand from the grinding stones. It was less a pleasure and more a tool for scooping up whatever other meager rations were available. Imagine the sheer, soul-crushing monotony of this diet. For breakfast, barley porridge. For your midday meal, a hard piece of barley bread. For your evening meal, after a day of backbreaking labor, more barley porridge. Day after day, week after week, for the entire duration of your forced service. It was a taste of eternity, and it tasted like boiled grain. There was, however, one other crucial component of the builder's diet, another gift from the benevolent god of barley: beer. Now, it is vital to understand that this was not the light, refreshing, filtered lager we know today. Mesopotamian beer was a thick, soupy, opaque beverage, more akin to a liquid sourdough than a modern pint. This liquid bread was a cornerstone of their caloric intake. It was safer to drink than water from a potentially contaminated canal, and it was packed with calories and B vitamins from the fermented grain. The brewing process, which involved fermenting barley bread in water, created a nutritious, if not exactly delicious, slurry that was a vital part of the daily ration. This was the builder's performance-enhancing supplement. This was his energy drink, but it was not a jolt of caffeine and sugar. It was lukewarm barley water, served with a side of exhaustion. It might provide a brief caloric boost and a slight dulling buzz from the alcohol content, but it was hardly enough to combat the profound fatigue of the work. While barley reigned supreme, other grains like emmer wheat did exist, but they were generally more expensive and less common in the rations for unskilled laborers. For the man hauling bricks, the world was made of barley, and his diet reflected that with a relentless, unwavering focus. A precious and carefully measured source of fat would have been provided in the form of sesame oil. This was a vital source of calories, essential for anyone performing such strenuous labor. A small cup of oil might have been added to the daily porridge or used to soften the hard barley bread. Like everything else, it was a ration, not a choice, doled out by a watchful overseer. What about the good stuff, the things that make a meal enjoyable? Vegetables might have made an appearance, depending on the season and the generosity of the ration master. Onions, garlic, and leeks were common and could be used to add a bit of desperately needed flavor to the endless porridge. Lentils or chickpeas might also be included, providing a welcome change in texture and a bit of extra protein. Fruit was an even greater luxury. The date palm was sacred in Mesopotamia, and its fruit was a wonderful source of sugar and energy. But it is unlikely that fresh or dried dates were a standard part of the daily ration for a common builder. They were a treat, a bonus, something to be savored on the rare occasion they were provided. The most critical deficiency in this diet was protein. Meat, whether from sheep, goats, or cattle, was incredibly expensive. Fish from the rivers were more common, but still not a daily staple for the lowest class of worker. A builder on a state project might taste meat only a handful of times a year, likely during a religious festival when the temples would distribute the meat from sacrifices. This chronic lack of protein would have been catastrophic. Protein is essential for building and repairing muscle tissue. The builder was engaged in work that was constantly breaking down his muscles, but his diet gave him almost none of the materials needed to rebuild them. He was in a state of constant physical decay, getting progressively weaker even as he worked. Beyond protein, the monotonous diet would have led to a host of other nutritional deficiencies. The lack of fresh fruits and certain vegetables would have meant a severe shortage of key vitamins like vitamin C. This could lead to scurvy, a horrifying disease that causes bleeding gums, loose teeth, and excruciating joint pain. Symptoms that would make heavy labor all but impossible. The builder's diet was, in short, a perfect recipe for chronic malnutrition. While it may have contained enough raw calories to prevent outright starvation, it lacked the essential building blocks for a healthy human body. They were being fueled, but they were not being nourished. Their bodies were being run on the lowest grade of fuel imaginable. And a malnourished body is, inevitably, a weak body. The builder would have been in a constant state of low-level fatigue, his muscles aching, his energy reserves always depleted. His capacity to work, his very reason for being on the site, was being fundamentally undermined by the very rations meant to sustain him. This state of malnutrition also had a devastating effect on the immune system. A body deprived of essential vitamins and minerals cannot effectively fight off infection or disease. This made the builders incredibly vulnerable to the illnesses that were rampant in their environment. The malaria from the swamps, the dysentery from the water, the infections from their daily cuts and scrapes. This created a terrifyingly vicious cycle. The poor diet led to a weakened body. A weakened body was more susceptible to disease. A diseased worker could not perform his labor. An unproductive worker would have his rations cut or be dismissed from the project entirely. This pushed him further into starvation and sickness, a downward spiral from which there was almost no escape. The state, in its cold calculation, was not trying to create a healthy workforce. It was trying to create the cheapest possible workforce. The ration system was designed to find the absolute lowest point on the graph where a man could still lift a brick without dropping dead. It was a system that valued the monument far more than the man. Think of it this way. The raw caloric energy contained in millions of bowls of barley porridge and millions of jugs of soupy beer was, through the painful alchemy of human labor, transformed into the potential energy of a ziggurat reaching for the sky. The chemistry of civilization was fueled by the chemistry of suffering. If this exploration of the grim realities of the past has brought a measure of peace to your own comfortable surroundings, if the story of their hardship helps you to appreciate your own rest, then please consider one final, simple act. It is an act that fuels our own work here. Let your finger find the subscribe button. It is a small, quiet gesture in the darkness of your room, but it is the most meaningful support you can give. It ensures that this channel, our own project, can continue. It guarantees that when you return to this space tomorrow night, a new story will be waiting. Subscribe now, and let the great, silent engine of history gently carry you to sleep. Come, leave the complexities of your day behind. Let your mind quiet, your body still, and your focus soften. We are journeying back to the ancient world, to the sun-drenched plains of Mesopotamia, we have examined the builder's body, the pain, the hunger, and the toil. Tonight, we go deeper into the unseen landscape of the builder's mind to explore the immense psychological toll of a life spent in labor. We have spoken at length of the physical burdens, the aching back, the broken bones, the blistering sun. But there is another kind of weight, a weight on the soul that comes from a life of relentless, repetitive, and unchosen work. These were the invisible wounds, the silent erosion of the human spirit that was as much a part of the job as mixing mud or carrying bricks. Imagine your life, your entire existence, reduced to a handful of simple, repeated motions. Scoop the mud, carry the basket, place the brick, turn the drying bricks, hoist the bitumen for 10, 12, 14 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, for months or years or even a lifetime. This was the rhythm of the builder's world, a rhythm of profound and soul-crushing monotony. At first, this rhythm might even be a comfort, a way to let the mind go blank and simply exist in the motion. But over time, this endless repetition becomes a cage. The brain, starved of novelty and challenge, begins to shut down. The world shrinks until it is composed of nothing more than the back of the man in front of you, the weight on your shoulders, and the next identical task awaiting you. How does one mark the passage of time when every day is a carbon copy of the last? The sun rises, the work begins. The sun sets, the work ends. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months, seasons into years. Time ceases to be a river carrying you forward and becomes a stagnant pool in which you are trapped. Your life is measured not in milestones, but in the number of bricks laid in an ever-expanding wall. In such a world, personal ambition withers and dies. What is there to strive for? There is no promotion to a better, easier job. There is no performance bonus for exceeding your brick-carrying quota. The only upward mobility was the ramp you were currently climbing. Your biggest achievement was laying another mud brick. Your biggest dream was probably a long nap. To survive this, the mind develops defense mechanisms. The most common is a deep, abiding apathy, a sense of detachment from your own actions. You go through the motions like an automaton. Your thoughts turn down to a low hum. You stop feeling the full weight of your circumstances because to truly feel it day after day would be unbearable. It is a form of self-preservation that slowly hollows you out from the inside. Consider the soundscape of this life. It was a symphony of monotony. The wet, rhythmic thud of mud being packed into molds, the soft, shuffling scrape of thousands of bare feet on dusty ground, the shouted, repetitive orders of the foreman, the collective weary groan of men heaving a heavy stone. There was no music, only the percussive soundtrack of endless labor. The visual world was just as limited. The color palette of the builder's life was composed of the brown of the earth, the pale yellow of the straw, the endless indifferent blue of the sky, and the deep dark black of the bitumen. It was a world largely drained of vibrant color, a landscape of muted tones that mirrored the muted state of the builder's inner life. Now let us add the heaviest weight of all, the utter lack of agency. As we have discussed, this was not a career a man chose. He was compelled, forced by the state's corvée system, or by the bonds of slavery. This complete powerlessness over the course of one's own life is one of the most profound sources of psychological distress a human can experience. The system was designed to be dehumanizing. To the scribes and overseers, the builders were not individuals with hopes and fears. They were a resource, a number on a clay tablet. They were listed as manpower, a collective noun that stripped them of their identity and reduced them to a unit of labor, as interchangeable and impersonal as the bricks they carried. Imagine the existential dread of knowing with absolute certainty that your life's precious and finite energy is being spent to realize someone else's dream. You are building a magnificent temple for a god you can only fear, or a glorious palace for a king you will never meet. The glory, the fame, the legacy, none of it is for you. You are merely the anonymous fuel for another man's ambition. This was made brutally clear by the practice of stamping the king's name on the bricks. Every time a builder laid a brick, he was placing a monument to his own anonymity and to the king's eternal fame. The injustice of this was a constant, tangible reminder of his place in the world. He was the forgotten creator, the invisible hand behind the throne. The primary motivation on the worksite was not inspiration or pride, but fear. The foreman was there to ensure quotas were met, and his methods were direct and physical. The fear of a blow from his stick, the fear of having your meager rations cut for being too slow, the fear of punishment. This was the psychological atmosphere. It was a culture of compliance driven by anxiety. This lack of control extended to every aspect of life. A man subject to the corvée labor tax could not properly plan his future. How could he decide when to plant his own fields or expand his own home, when he knew that at any moment the state could demand months of his time? His life was perpetually on hold, subject to the whims of a distant authority. Over time, this could lead to a deep sense of fatalism, a belief that this suffering was simply your ordained lot in life, decreed by the gods. This might serve as a coping mechanism, a way to accept the unacceptable, but it is a bleak and hopeless philosophy, a surrender of the spirit that accepts suffering as a permanent and unchangeable condition of being. Where, in all this, could a builder find a moment of relief? It would have been in the smallest, most fleeting of human connections, a shared, knowing glance with a fellow worker, a quiet, dark joke about the foreman, whispered when he was out of earshot. The simple camaraderie that comes from enduring a shared hardship. These tiny sparks of humanity would have been fiercely precious. The daily beer ration, too, was more than just nutrition. The mild, dulling effect of the alcohol was likely a welcome escape. It would have taken the sharp edges off the physical pain and the mental anguish, providing a brief, state-sanctioned respite from the crushing reality of their existence. It was a tool for managing not just hunger, but also despair. What could a person in this situation possibly dream of? Not of wealth or fame. Their dreams would have been small, simple, and desperate. The dream of a rainy day when work might be cancelled. The dream of an extra portion of onions in their porridge. The dream of their term of service ending so they could return to their own family, their own field, their own life for a little while. The priests and kings would have told the builders that their work was deeply meaningful, that they were serving the gods and creating an eternal legacy. But meaning is hard to feel when your back is breaking and your stomach is empty. The grand cosmic purpose of the ziggurat likely felt very distant and abstract compared to the immediate, tangible meaninglessness of carrying the 10,000th brick of the day. Ultimately, the builder's mind would have been in a state of profound exhaustion that mirrored his body. The sheer physical depletion left little energy for complex thought or deep emotion. Life became a simple, primal equation. Work, eat, attempt to rest, and then repeat. It was a state of being reduced to its most basic, functional components. The mind of the builder, then, was the invisible scaffold upon which the great cities were built. It was a structure weathered by monotony, strained by powerlessness, and eroded by a lack of meaning. The psychological cost of building civilization was just as high as the physical, paid in silent anxieties and forgotten dreams. As you lie there now, in your own quiet and safe space, consider the profound luxury of a mind at peace. The builders of Mesopotamia built great monuments, but they likely never knew that simple comfort. Their legacy is cast in crumbling brick, but it is also written in the silent, unseen history of human endurance against the crushing weight of a life without choice. If this journey into the inner world of the past has brought a measure of stillness to your own mind, if these stories help you to find your own peace, then please consider a final, simple act. Your support is the foundation upon which these narratives are built. Find the subscribe button. A single, quiet click from you ensures that our work can continue, that these stories from the dark recesses of history will be here for you whenever you need them. Subscribe now, and let the silence of the ages be your guide to a deep and restful sleep. Let us settle in once more, letting the quiet of the night envelop us. Our journey takes us back again to ancient Mesopotamia, to the world of the builder. We have felt their pain, shared their meager meals, and understood their lack of freedom. Tonight we arrive at the final, most profound tragedy of their existence, the heartbreaking impermanence of everything they built. Imagine dedicating your entire life, your sweat, your health, your very soul to constructing a monument intended to last for eternity. You pour your existence into the raising of a great temple or a colossal wall, a structure meant to honor immortal gods and immortalize the name of your king. And then you watch it begin to dissolve before your very eyes. This was the ultimate, bitter irony for the Mesopotamian builder. The magnificent civilization they erected was built almost entirely of mud, and mud, when confronted with the forces of nature, has a tendency to remember what it once was. The builder's legacy was not written in stone, it was written in dust, a temporary statement in a conversation with erosion. The primary enemy, the ultimate villain in the story of Mesopotamian architecture, was water. The very same water from the Tigris and Euphrates that was used to mix the clay was relentlessly determined to reclaim it. Every rainfall, every flood, every drop of morning dew was an act of architectural sabotage, a quiet, persistent effort to undo the builder's work. Picture a newly completed city wall after its first rainy season. The sharp, crisp corners of the thousands of bricks would begin to soften and round off. The smooth, flat surface would become pitted and uneven as the outer layer of clay sloughed off in muddy rivulets. The base of the wall, absorbing moisture from the damp ground, would begin to turn back into a thick, pasty sludge. At a major flood, a common disaster in this land was a cataclysm. A torrent of water could undermine the foundations of a ziggurat, causing it to sag and crack. It could wash away entire sections of a defensive wall, leaving the city vulnerable. All the work, all the suffering could be erased in a single violent afternoon. The gods gave the water, and the gods, it seemed, used it to wash their slates clean. But water was not the only foe. The wind, sweeping across the flat, arid plains, was a patient and tireless adversary. Carrying fine particles of sand and dust, it acted like a slow-mixing bandblaster, constantly scouring the surface of the mud-brick structures. Over the decades, this relentless wind would erode details, soften edges, and wear away the very substance of the buildings. There was also a hidden enemy working from within: salt. The groundwater in Mesopotamia was often rich with dissolved mineral salts. This salty water would be drawn up into the porous bricks through capillary action, like a thirsty straw. As the water evaporated from the brick surface, it would leave the salt crystals behind. These crystals would grow, expand, and exert an immense internal pressure, causing the brick to flake, splinter, and crumble from the inside out. Even the sun, the builder's essential partner in baking the bricks, was a fickle ally. The constant, intense heat would make the bricks brittle over time. The daily cycle of extreme heat, followed by cooler nights, caused the structures to expand and contract again and again, creating microscopic cracks that would grow over the years, inviting the wind and rain to continue their destructive work. You spend your life building something, only for it to slowly melt back into the earth. Efficient, right? The entire enterprise was a constant, losing battle against the fundamental forces of nature. The builders were tasked with creating permanence out of one of the most impermanent materials on earth. This inherent fragility meant that a builder's work was never, ever truly done. The great monuments of Mesopotamia were not just built, they were perpetually being built. They required constant maintenance, a permanent industry of repair and restoration. The warranty on a new ziggurat was essentially good until the next big rain. This created a grim and inescapable form of job security. A man might spend his youth as a corvée laborer building a new section of the city wall. In his middle age, he might be called back to repair the damage from a recent flood. And as an old man, he might watch his own son being conscripted to tear down and replace a section of the very wall he had built, a section that had now crumbled beyond repair. A new king's ascension to the throne was often marked by a flurry of construction activity, but this often meant restoring the decaying monuments of his predecessors. A king would gain immense prestige by rebuilding the crumbling temple of a famous ancestor, a pious act that also conveniently allowed him to stamp his own name on the new bricks, attaching himself to the glory of the past. The process of repair was often as miserable as the initial construction. It involved hacking away the rotten, muddy outer layers of a structure, clearing the debris, and then refacing it with new bricks. It was a dusty, difficult, and demoralizing task, the architectural equivalent of patching a sinking ship with buckets of mud. This endless cycle of construction, decay, and rebuilding is precisely what creates the archaeological sites we see today, the great, gently sloping mounds, or tells, that dot the Iraqi landscape are not natural hills. They are the layered remains of ancient cities, each layer representing a new city built upon the melted, collapsed ruins of the one before it. They are mountains of urban decay. Imagine the psychological weight of this, to know with certainty that the work to which you have dedicated your life is temporary, to see the product of your own sweat and suffering begin to fail within your own lifetime. It strips the work of any lasting meaning. Why strive for perfection when nature will inevitably reduce your efforts to a formless mound of dirt? What makes this even more tragic is that they knew how to build for permanence. They had the technology of the kiln-filled brick, a material as durable as stone and resistant to water, but this was a luxury. It required immense quantities of fuel, which was scarce. So the state made a cold, economic calculation. The endless supply of forced labor to repair and rebuild was deemed cheaper than the fuel required to build it correctly the first time. The monuments, in a way, were treated as being just as disposable as the men who built them. The state's concern was not for 1,000 years from now. It was for the glory of the current king. The future could worry about its own crumbling walls. This created a system where the primary product was not a lasting building, but a perpetual need for more labor. And so, today, the glory of Mesopotamia is largely gone. The mighty city of Babylon is a landscape of melted, formless mounds. The great walls of Uruk are low ridges in the dust. The ziggurats are slumped, eroded hills, their sharp step lines blurred by millennia of wind and rain. Their ephemeral glory has returned to the earth. Contrast this with the stone temples of ancient Egypt or the marble monuments of Rome. Though they are ruins, their forms are still clear, their substance still intact. They were built by cultures with access to permanent materials. The Mesopotamian builder was denied this. His legacy was, by design, biodegradable. The builder's own life was as ephemeral as his work. He lived a short, hard life, and at the end of it he too would return to the earth. The structures he built mirrored his own existence, a brief, difficult struggle followed by a slow, inevitable decay back into the dust from which all things came. The ultimate cruelty of the builder's life, then, was this essential futility. To pour so much pain and effort into something destined to dissolve was the final, cosmic joke. The monuments were not timeless, they were temporary. Their purpose was to project an image of power and piety for a fleeting moment, a moment paid for by the lifetimes of thousands of forgotten men. As you lie there, on the verge of sleep, think of the solid walls around you, the sturdy roof over your head. Think of the permanence you take for granted. The builders of Mesopotamia knew no such certainty. They were ghosts, building with dust, their greatest achievements destined to be washed away by the uncaring rains of history. If this final, somber chapter in the builder's story has helped to bring a sense of peace and perspective to your own world, then please, consider one last act. It is a gesture that helps us build something more lasting here, a community dedicated to exploring these forgotten histories. Find the subscribe button. Let your support be the one permanent mark you make tonight. A simple click ensures that these stories will not fade away, but will be here to greet you again, whenever you seek refuge in the quiet of the past. Subscribe now, and sleep well. And so, our long journey through the dust and heat of ancient Mesopotamia comes to a quiet end. We have walked the sprawling worksites, felt the unforgiving sun on our necks, and heard the endless, rhythmic thud of mud being packed into molds. We have followed the builder through his grueling day, and now we take one last look back to reflect on the totality of his unfortunate existence. The story of the Mesopotamian builder is the great foundational contradiction of human history. This was the civilization that gave us writing, complex laws, astronomy, and the very concept of the city. It was a triumph of the human intellect. Yet every single one of these intellectual advancements was built upon a foundation of the most primitive, brutal, and agonizing physical labor imaginable. The glory of the scribe's tablet was paid for, in full, by the calloused and broken hands of the builder. We have seen the world through his eyes, an environment that was actively hostile, a workplace of relentless torment. The sun was a furnace in the sky, offering no shade and no mercy. The two great rivers, the very source of life, were fickle and violent, capable of unleashing catastrophic floods that could erase months of work in a single afternoon. And the stagnant waters they left behind bred swarms of insects, bringing fevers that sapped a man's strength and spirit. We have felt the weight of his tools, or rather, his lack of them. In a world without engines or complex machinery, the builder's own body was the primary machine. His back was the crane, his legs were the pistons, his hands were the shovels. We have seen how this relentless, unassisted labor, hauling and lifting millions of tons of earth and brick, would have systematically destroyed his body, leaving him with chronic pain and debilitating injuries in a world with no medicine to heal him. We have peered into his mind and felt the immense psychological weight of his life, a life, for many, that was not chosen, a life of forced labor, compelled by the unyielding authority of a king or a temple. We have contemplated the soul-crushing monotony of the work, the endless repetition of simple tasks, and the profound meaninglessness of pouring one's finite life energy into a monument for a distant ruler, with no hope for personal reward or recognition. And we have arrived at the final bitter irony. After all the suffering, the sweat, the sickness, the injuries, the fear, the hopelessness, the magnificent structures they built were, by their very nature, destined to crumble. Made of sun-dried mud, these great testaments to power were built to fail. The ziggurats and walls would slowly melt under the rain and erode in the wind, ensuring that the next generation would be called upon to endure the very same cycle of miserable work all over again. So as you lie here now, on the edge of a peaceful sleep, take a moment for a strange kind of gratitude. Be grateful for concrete that does not dissolve, for steel that does not rot, and for the simple, beautiful existence of a safety railing. Be thankful for a job that does not require you to be baked alive, for a diet that is more than just barley porridge, and for the freedom to choose your own path, however humble. The foundations of our modern world were laid in the Fertile Crescent, thousands of years ago, but those foundations were mixed with the sweat, the blood, and the silent suffering of countless, forgotten builders. Their existence was a brutal, tragic, and from our safe distance, an almost hilariously awful ordeal. Being a builder in ancient Mesopotamia truly, profoundly, and spectacularly sucked. Thank you for joining us on this journey. May your dreams be peaceful and your history lessons deeply, deeply comforting. And now, a final thought before we part. If this series, this deep and detailed dive into the delightful misery of the past, has brought you some measure of quiet or comfort, then we ask you to build one small, permanent thing for us. Find the subscribe button. It is a simple, effortless click in the quiet of your room. Your subscription is the kiln-filed, waterproof brick upon which this channel is built. It ensures that when you return, seeking another story from the dark, we will be here. Thank you for listening. Subscribe now and sleep well.